One day, a very young actor walked from London to Richmond to see if he could ask the famous Edmond Kean one question.
What do you want, Cocky?
Please, sir, how can I succeed in our profession?
Do you know how to starve, Cocky? Do you know how to starve?
Is that all, sir?
That's all, Cocky.
Edmond Kean was perhaps the greatest actor who has ever spoken in the English language. He was born on March the 17th, 1788, here in London. Soon after Kean's birth, his mother, who had the inclinations of a whore, deserted him, and the destitute child was taken care of by a spinster actress named Charlotte Tidswell. 3 years later, Kean's alcoholic father committed suicide by walking off a roof. The question is, what should posterity have expected from that baby boy after such an inheritance? Of course, Edmund was fortunate in the love of Charlotte Tidswell, whom he called Aunt Tid, and they lived here in Covent Garden at 12 Tavistock Row, which used to stand over there, close to the great Drury Lane Theatre. His greatest treat was to be allowed into the green room, the players' rest room at this Drury Lane Theatre. There the old actors sat around and encouraged the child to declaim speeches from the great tragedies. They told him, "You're a clever little boy." By the age of 8 years, he was making professional appearances in children's parts on this mighty stage. And then Edmond Kean, little more than a child, deliberately decided to stand alone. And he also decided very clearly what his future must be. He would become the greatest actor in the whole of Britain. And though so young, he fully understood the size of the mountain that lay before him. In the year 1803, there were only 2 theatres in London permitted to play the great classics of drama. These theatres were Covent Garden and Drury Lane. And their monopoly on the classics was by government decree. And it was in these theatres, and only these theatres, that the histrionic heavyweight championships of Britain were fought. Actors and actresses were then encouraged to develop their talents to a size and power almost unknown in the weak and passionless British theatres of today. The public of 175 years ago simply wanted to know which player was the greatest, to coin a phrase. And the actors and actresses fought this issue out primarily with Shakespeare's plays in the great arenas of Covent Garden and here in Drury Lane. There was only one route for such as Kean, and that was a circuitous journey by the cruel road of barns and stables and theatres that were scattered liberally throughout the provinces of the British Isles. And it was in those far-flung places that the preliminary eliminating bouts were fought for the hope of an invitation to compete in this great metropolis of London. And so in the year 1804, the small figure of Edmond Kean walked towards those provincial theatres, and considering that he was barely 15 years old, he was soon doing pretty well as a juvenile phenomenon at Sheerness. A year later, full of confidence, he moved to one of the grander provincial theatres, the Theatre Royal Belfast. And it was here that he learnt a new hard fact of theatrical life. In Belfast, the theatre management did not regard him as a juvenile phenomenon, and he was, quote, scarcely permitted to deliver a message. His agony of frustration had begun, and he could only withdraw into his own dark, lonely nature. And then suddenly he sensed a small hope. Sarah Siddons, sister of John Philip Kemble, and probably the greatest actress in the history of the British theatre, arrived in Belfast to perform for a few performances with the Theatre Royal Company. The cast was summoned to her lodgings for the purpose of rehearsing the words. It was, and sadly still is, customary for players on these occasions to quickly mumble their lines. Young Edmund, as usual, had very little to speak, but when his cue came, he spoke his few words as if it had been the first night. And the grandest of theatrical ladies stopped the rehearsal and addressed Edmond Kean. "Very well, sir, very well. I have never heard that part given in that way before." Those words were prophetic. "I have never heard that part given in that way before." But then Sarah Siddons added, "Very well, sir. Unfortunately, there is too little of him wherewith to make a great actor." Mark you, she had a point. Edmund Kean was now fully grown, but he was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, very short for a man. And so, in 1807, bitterly frustrated, he moved back to Sheerness, where his salary was increased to 1 guinea a week, and where he got some of the parts that he wanted. But he did not altogether escape Sarah Siddons' particular prejudice. One night he was playing Alexander the Great, and as he entered onto the stage, an intoxicated naval officer shouted from his box,
"Alexander the Great! More like Alexander the Little!"
"Sir, I may be little in stature, but I have a great soul." It has been said that the audience responded to that statement with loud nautical cheers. And then, at the beginning of 1808, Edmund left Sheerness a second time, very suddenly. Local tradition has it that he was caught in a compromising position with the baker's wife. He managed to throw himself to safety aboard the Chatham boat. By March 1808, he had secured a job at the Gloucester Theatre. Here he met 2 sisters, Mary and Susan Chambers. He overheard Mary Chambers inquire, "Who is the shabby little man with the brilliant eyes?" Kean asked loudly, "And who the hell is she?" On July the 17th, 1808, here in the town of Stroud, Edmund Kean borrowed half a guinea and married Mary Chambers, who was 9 years his senior. And then they started their wanderings, typical strolling players. And his inner burning frustration deepened. He was fighting to communicate something very personal, but people, critics, did not comprehend. The Staffordshire Advertiser stated, "Mr. Kean, who has been figuring here as the principal tragic hero, is another instance of the blundering folly of misplacing actors. This performer's genius is nevertheless of an elevated cast. He is a good harlequin." That cruel critic knew how to injure. Kean pondered and pondered the intricacies of Hamlet and loathed to put on the tinsel of harlequin.
Never feel so degraded as when I have the motley jacket on my back.
Mary, his new wife, watched him glower uncomprehendingly. Her own words were, "He stutters and slaves beyond any actor I ever knew. He mopes for hours, walking miles and miles alone, with his hands in his pockets, thinking intensely on his characters. No one can get a word from him." And already Edmund Kean was abusing himself into oblivion with heavy drinking. And then he was offered a job at a theatre in Swansea, South Wales, at a salary of 25 shillings per week. But there was no money to pay for transport. And so they walked from Birmingham to Swansea. And Mary was already 6 months pregnant with their first child. It was, of course, a terrible journey. Kean glowered on. He was used to deprivation. But Mary was deeply shocked, and the horror of that journey never left her. And it was in Swansea that their son, Howard Kean, was born. Kean never loved anyone as much as he loved this child. He swore that Howard would be educated to be a gentleman. As Kean put it, Howard will be entitled to the respect of both high and low. Kean's class consciousness was understandably very deeply etched, and little Howard, so he swore, would never suffer that crushing humiliation. During the summer of 1811, towards the end of an engagement in Ireland, Mary and Edmund's second son, Charles, was born. For the next 6 months, they all suffered the most appalling deprivations. They wandered over England and Scotland on the verge of starvation, desperately looking for work. And on those massive journeys, Edmond Kean often carried his frail little son Howard on his back. They barely survived by selling pieces of clothing and by giving family entertainments. And on those occasions, Kean wrote the playbills in his own hand. And this is one of them. Under patronage, Mr. and Mrs. Kean, for one night only, on their way to London. And Kean stuck those playbills up personally. And he kept repeating to his family, a better time will come by and by, a better time will come by and by. But the suffering they endured had undermined their family health, and in particular the health of Howard. Suddenly Kean looked at his eldest son and quietly and firmly renounced his obsession to be recognized as the greatest actor in Britain. In desperation, Kean appealed to his sometime foster mother, Aunt Tid. Could she speak to someone? He was prepared to forget the classic theatres of Drury Lane and Covent Garden. Aunt Tid spoke to Mr. Robert Elliston, who was about to open the Olympic Theatre at Wick Street in London. And Elliston offered him a job. Kean accepted without hesitation. Now all seemed settled. But Robert Elliston was a pretty ruthless, crafty showman, and he failed to discuss categorical terms with Kean and informed him that his engagement would not commence immediately. So Edmund was compelled to play in the town of Dorchester while he waited. And then, on the evening of November the 15th, 1813, at the end of a performance, Kean noticed a man gazing at him from one of the boxes. After Kean had left the stage, the stranger confronted him and said, "My name is Arnold. I am the manager of Drury Lane Theatre." Edmund Kean said, "I staggered as if I had been shot." He had waited and fought for 8 seemingly hopeless years, and suddenly Samuel Arnold was offering him £8 per week for the first year, 9 for the second, and 10 for the third. Financial riches that would take care of Howard, plus the opportunity to demonstrate his power on the stage of Drury Lane Theatre. Kean rushed back to his family. He kept repeating, "Our fortune is made, our fortune is made." Then he added, "If Howard only gets well." We shall all be happy yet.
7 days later, the beloved child, Howard, died. Edmond Kean wrote a letter to a friend.
The joy that I felt at the flattering prospect of future prosperity is now obliterated by the unexpected loss of my child. Howard, sir, died on Monday morning last. You may conceive my feelings and pardon the brevity of my letter. In the midst of my affliction, I remember your kindness, and with greatest respect, sign myself, yours, etc., E. Kean.
And then his grief broke. Mary believed that he had gone completely mad. He rushed from their lodgings and consumed bottles of brandy. He came raging back, swearing that he had the power to bring his little boy back to life. Finally, the morning came and Kean sat still. He simply said, "No one must ever speak Howard's name ever again."
It was December of the year 1813 when hungry Kean called at Drury Lane and collected his first incredible £8. The family moved to relatively expensive rooms at 21 Cecil Street. Kean secured a promise from manager Arnold that his debut would be as Shylock in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. He insisted on this because that character, plus the long Jewish gabardine, would not accentuate his small body.
And then Kean went to collect his second £8 and was informed that his name had been struck off the Drury Lane payroll. The manager, Samuel Arnold, said,
"Young man, you have acted a strange part in engaging with me when you're already bound to Mr. Elliston."
Elliston, who was a man inflated with self-importance, sensed that he had been walked over and was refusing to release Kean from their very slim agreement. Kean desperately appealed to Elliston. "Sir, the fate of my family is in your hands. Are you determined to crush the object that never injured you? Am I to be cast into the provinces again for the Olympic Theatre? I will never enter."
It was bitterly cold in London. The River Thames was covered with ice, and if it hadn't been for a kind landlady, it is difficult to imagine how the Keans could have avoided starving to death. However, one thing was on their side. Drury Lane Theatre was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the management was desperately throwing actors onto the stage in a forlorn hope that the public would respond enthusiastically to one of them. They all failed.
Kean himself would not budge from the vicinity of the theatre. He became an actor's joke. They referred to him as the little man in the capes, as he waited week after week, huddled in a large coat to protect himself from the bitter weather. Finally, he turned on them. "Let me but once set my foot before the floats, and I'll let you see what I am."
And suddenly Robert Elliston broke. He grandly renounced his claim on Kean's services. As far as the Drury Lane management went, there was now another actor available that they could throw at the audience, and they would hope for the best.
It was January the 26th, 1814. The Drury Lane playbill stated, "The Merchant of Venice will be played with Mr. Kean in the part of Shylock, his first appearance." Kean, weak from undernourishment, simply said, "Today I must dine." The weather was terrible. The theatre was 1/3 full.
In that audience on that night, no one had come to see The Merchant of Venice. Everyone knew the play. The focus of interest was always, what will the actor do with it? And again, there had been no rehearsals as such. All of the players knew the parts. They would simply react to whatever the new Shylock did. And incidentally, players are usually brave people. They suppress their agony of nerves as best they can. Someone overheard Kean secretively mutter,
I wish I was going to be shot.
He refused to occupy a dressing room surrounded by the actors who had made fun of him.
Lost music?
He put on his makeup and dressed in the humblest corner of Drury Lane amongst the walk-ons. He immediately caused a sensation because he had rejected the traditional physical concept of Shylock. Appalled, someone exclaimed, "He's not wearing the red Judas wig." The stage manager could not believe his eyes. He said, "It is an innovation. Depend upon it, it will not do."
I wish it to be so. If I am wrong, the public will soon put me right.
Yes, well, it was the public that the stage manager was worried about. In those days of British vitality, you crossed the public at your peril.
Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto, you have rated me about my monies and my usances.
Actors and actresses were lounging about the green room, waiting for their calls. Suddenly they became aware of an unexpected noise coming from the auditorium. People were applauding. People were cheering. The players left the green room and hurried to the wings to see what was happening. Perhaps no one had ever seen such a sight before. Certainly no one has seen such a sight since Edmond Kean left us. On the stage of Drury Lane that night, there was no sign of the statuesque ritual of beautiful John Philip Kemble. Instead, there was a minute figure who appeared to fill the stage and who was, well, to quote the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, revealing Shakespeare by flashes of lightning. Yes, that is the most famous and incisive description of what took place on this stage on January the 26th, 1814. When the performance was over, Edmond Kean walked silently past staring people to the poor room where the walk-ons waited. And there he took off his dignified Jewish gabardine and put on his own threadbare, shabby clothes. He rejected all celebration and quietly left the theater to hurry home to poor Mary and little Charles. He said, "Mary, you shall ride in your carriage, and Charlie shall go to Eton." And then he briefly added, "If only Howard had but lived to see it." And he wept for love of his dead child. Next day, the Morning Chronicle appeared with William Hazlitt's criticism. For voice, eye, action, and expression, no actor has come out for many years at all equal to him. It would be difficult to single out a competitor. Hazlitt also wrote that there were aspects of Kean's performance which were, quote, "the finest commentary that was ever made on Shakespeare," unquote. The finest commentary that was ever made on Shakespeare. Yes, we players will settle for that. Kean, at his first attempt, had become the heavyweight champion by a devastating knockout. John Philip Kemble and all that he conservatively stood for would never be the same again. On February the 12th, 1814, Kean appeared for the first time as Richard III in Shakespeare's play.
Sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that's so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me!
The effect of this performance on a packed audience can only be described as cataclysmic. They stood and stormed their approval. The London Morning Post reported, "Edmond Kean's attraction was unprecedented in the annals of theatricals. It was generally admitted that he was honoured with more approbation than ever was experienced by the oldest actor on the stage."
I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days.
And suddenly Drury Lane Theatre was made solvent by the genius of one player. The box office was besieged by thousands of people fighting to get in.
They were taking about £600 every performance that Kean played. Samuel Arnold informed the committee of the theatre, "Mr. Kean has succeeded beyond the capacity of any actor within my recollection."
Kean then went on to perform his Hamlet, Othello, and Iago. And at that meeting, in this very room, it was decided to give Edmund an immediate bonus of 100 guineas and to present him with a new unasked-for contract at £16 per week for the current season, £18 per week for the following season, and £20 per week thereafter. And after he performed his Hamlet, they simply gave him £20 per week immediately. The Kean family continued to live for the time being at 21 Cecil Street, but the interior now presented an extraordinary sight. The mantelpiece was piled high with banknotes, and little Charles amused himself by rolling golden sovereigns across the floor. At the theatre, the greatest in the land came to look and listen. On May the 19th, Thomas More and Lord Byron appeared, and after the performance visited the green room to congratulate Kean. Lord Byron said of Kean, "By God, he is a soul."
On June the 16th, Edmond Kean's first season at Drury Lane ended, and then, accompanied by Mary, he commenced a royal progress into the provinces. He was hailed everywhere as a national hero. Kean said, "I intend to make hay while the sun shines." Understandably, he was a little distrustful and intolerant of his success. He said to a friend, "I have often acted Othello in the same manner as now calls down such thunders of applause when the whole house laughed at me. After that, can you think I care much for public taste?" And remembering that insensitivity of audiences in his days of struggle, Kean, in his days of success, could be very naughty indeed. One evening, on a stage of a theatre in Birmingham, he had to deliver the line, "Take her, sir," to which he clearly added, "and you can take the Birmingham audience into the bargain." But he had no worries, really. He finished his first 8 months having earned £4,000. In 1815, the Keans moved to Mayfair.
Here, amidst the upper-class respectability of Clarges Street, Kean was viciously pulled between two brutally conflicting class systems, and for a period he did not know how or where to turn. On one occasion, Lord Byron organized a select dinner party in honor of Kean. After a while, Edmund excused himself, stating that he was ill. Later, Lord Byron discovered that he was in no way ill and had in fact hastened to a supper party given in honor of a famous pugilist. That was it.
Kean was given the choice, and he suffered the compulsion to move towards what has been called the disreputable element. He rejected class privilege, and he became committed emotionally with what was called the lower orders. He actually sparred with the great pugilist Mendoza. These people, he felt, were his own kind. It is the sad price of a class-ridden society. Kean was now earning enormous money, at least £10,000 a year. Not that his professional life was a smooth voyage. The committee of Drury Lane prevailed upon him to play Romeo, and he had no sympathy for sentimental Romeo. His performance of the part was not a success. During October 1816, at the Brighton Theatre, a new star appeared on the theatrical firmament, a certain Junius Brutus Booth. A rumour had it that he was another dynamic Edmond Kean, and Covent Garden, badly needing a dynamic Edmond Kean, snapped him up. And the young actor had the temerity to open his engagement by playing Edmund's famous character, Richard III. And his performance was cheered hysterically. Well, Edmund, who was quite determined to remain the undisputed champion, must have heard those cheers over at the garden. And then he, together with the Drury Lane committee, by a bit of luck, also heard that Booth was dissatisfied with his salary. It is said that with alacrity, Edmund seduced Booth over to Drury Lane with the exciting proposition that he, Booth, should play Iago to his Kean's Othello. And innocent Booth bit. The performance took place on February the 20th, 1817. It was to be nothing less than the fight of the century. There were riots to get into Drury Lane. The London Morning Post reported, on entering, Mr. Booth was welcomed by thunders of applause. And then the histrionic punches were thrown. The critic of the Morning Post continued, Booth commenced his performance with great success. But as the play advanced, he lost the high ground on which he had stood. With another actor in Othello, the Iago of the evening might have been thought great. But by the side of Kean. And what of Kean himself? How did he do it? A shocked observer remembered, up and down, to and fro Kean went, like a caged lion who had received his fatal hurt, but whose strength was still undiminished. The fury and whirlwind of the passions seemed to have endowed him with supernatural strength. His eyes were glittering and bloodshot, his veins were swollen, and his whole figure restless and violent. It seemed dangerous to cross his path, and death to assault him. An old actor who was in this theatre that night was also shocked to see Booth overwhelmed and destroyed by the Olympic storm around him. He said, when Kean rushed off the stage in the third act, I felt my face deluged with tears. A thing that has not happened to me since I was a crack this high. Of course, it was the beginning and the end for Junius Brutus Booth at Drury Lane. He was advertised to go through it all again on February the 22nd, but Booth did not appear. He went into hiding, and I don't blame him. And then on August the 7th, 1819, there came an announcement from the Drury Lane administration which was a horrible blow for Kean. It came, surprisingly, from Mr. Robert Elliston. You remember the actor-manager who had made Kean's debut in London very difficult.
Mr. Robert Elliston has the honor to inform the public that he has become the lessee of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane for 14 years.
Well, Edmund's first reaction to that piece of news was to get the hell out of it. An ambition to act far, far away in the United States of America immediately flared in his mind. But to his shocked dismay, he found that Elliston would hold him to his contract here in London. However, Elliston always knew which side his bread was buttered, and he was immediately very, very nice to the champion of the British stage. And finally, Edmund became reconciled to working for Elliston for 1 year. Then he would be free to cross the Atlantic. And during that year, Kean acted King Lear for the first time. Previously, it had been banned because the reigning king, George III, was also potty. Like King Lear. Finally, Kean was free to leave, and he gave many, many farewell performances. On the last of them in London, he made a speech.
It is with pain I announce to you a long period must elapse before I can again have the honor of coming before you. And when I reflect on the uncertainty of life, the sentiment will obtrude itself that this may possibly be my last appearance on these boards. The very tightly packed audience reacted as Edmund would have wished. No, no, they screamed, no, no!
No, no, we hope not.
And Edmund, knowing his business better than anyone else, broke down and wept. But, pulling himself together, he managed to conclude, I must now bid you farewell. Edmond Kean was a fantastic success in America. Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore. He was the usual knockout. No one had ever seen anything like it before. Kean was now earning £1,000 per month. Or as he put it, I am making money and fame by bushels. He was now 30 years old, and the year was 1820. And then he made a big mistake. He'd already played Boston, that ever-critical city, and he'd been a tremendous success. Now he wanted to return. The management of the Boston Theatre warned him not to go back immediately because it was summer, and Bostonians, so the management explained, never went to the theatre out of season. Kean brushed their advice aside. Had not Bostonians fought to gain admission during his last visit? Indeed, Edmund had been so impressed that he had praised Boston as the literary emporium of the New World. Well, the management was right. On the opening night, Kean played King Lear, and to his dismay, he faced a poor house. A few days later, he prepared to essay his most famous role, Richard III.
He anxiously peeped through the curtain and was horrified. There were barely 20 people seated, Kean stated. In the whole course of my professional career, I've never been so humiliated. And he refused to go on. And he left the theatre. And after he left, people began to arrive, including, quote, Colonel Perkins and other distinguished citizens, unquote. And Kean, pursued by some willful demon, refused to return, and finally the manager was forced to announce, Mr. Kean has positively refused to play on account of lack of patronage.
Well, no one could have predicted the violent reaction. Kean was lucky to get out of Boston with his life. To Bostonians, the hero had suddenly become a degenerate overnight. One newspaper expressed the violent animosity accurately. Kean should be taken by his nose and dragged before the curtain to make his excuses for his conduct. And the rage against Kean roared across America. A more potent example of the treacherous condition of unbridled adulation it would be difficult to find. A Philadelphia newspaper, the Democratic Press, summed it up. Edmond Kean must never again be permitted to appear before an American audience. Edmund walked up Broadway and returned to Britain.
Elliston needed Kean back at Drury Lane. And like the big showman he was, he tried to understand him. There were, quote, 6 outriders in a medley of costume of all nations of the earth. Then came Elliston himself in solitary grandeur in his own carriage, drawn by 4 greys. The hero of the triumph next, Kean himself, likewise in his carriage, drawn by 4 black horses. A troop of horsemen formed the flank, composed of bruisers, jockeys, tavern keepers, and other friends of the drama. And 50 soldiers paraded at the stage door of Drury Lane. That night, Kean played Richard III, and the vast audience cheered him as, quote, had never been heard before.
But the truth is, nothing for Kean would ever be the same again. The mark that had threatened for so long was now on him. His American experience had disturbed him deeply, and his nature, his state of mind had shifted. The initial touch of domestic doom was, as it very often is, farcical. Kean had overdrunk and overwhored for years, but now he thought himself to be in love with a married woman who had pretensions of respectability. Her name was Charlotte, and she was the wife of a certain Alderman Robert Cox. The explosion around Kean began when his wife Mary discovered a letter from Charlotte, and the devastation was completed when the alderman read a bundle of over-personal letters to his wife, written by Kean. The alderman promptly began proceedings against the famous actor for criminal conversation with my wife. The truth is that Mrs. Cox was what used to be called a loose woman, promiscuous. And both she and the alderman had accepted considerable sums of money from Kean. But the trial went ahead, and Kean did almost nothing to defend himself. The appallingly ridiculous letters were read out loud in court, and Kean was found guilty and ordered to pay the alderman £800. The end result was a furore comparable to the disaster in America.
There was a deluge of cartoons and printed jokes, but Edmond Kean, with impressive courage, decided to face his public on the stage of Drury Lane, playing the character of Richard III. Suffice it to say that there was a non-stop riot. Edmund himself would not give up, and gradually, succeeding performances were heard more and more clearly, till finally it could be adjudged that Kean had won through. But he took a monstrous beating. Socially, he was now a total outcast. Whether he wanted the company of aristocrats and respectable respectability or not, he was now excluded. Of course, his own circle of rogues and vagabonds still welcomed him.
And the truth is, Edmond Kean now began to wallow in a self-conscious, self-flagellating degeneracy of impressive proportions. The acting manager of Drury Lane, a man named Winston, reported that one day Kean instructed, "I do not wish tomorrow's rehearsals to start before midday, because tonight I intend to get drunk. Oh, and I shall require 3 whores in my dressing room during the performance to tide me over the intervals." And Kean was not joking. And that formidable ambition apparently became common practice. Then Kean fatalistically decided to go back to America. Persecution in Britain was more painful for him than persecution over there. He wrote to a friend whimsically, "Damn Drury and Bonaparte, now for America." Kean was a fighter and an optimist, but no one could have foreseen the rage that greeted him in America. It had something to do with his staggering talent, which could be publicly adored and then suddenly deeply resented. It is a common historical and domestic phenomenon. Kean performed and performed at packed houses which shouted hostility, mixed with a little adulation. Mark you, in his determination to return to Boston, Kean was nothing less than foolhardy. He stood in the wings of the Boston Theater and listened to the men roar like beasts. No woman was allowed to be present. Kean had the astounding courage to enter as Richard III. Bottles and other objects were hurled at him, and finally he was forced to leave the stage. And he wept. The very first hint of defeat. And then the audience attacked and attempted to lynch him. Kean escaped by the skin of his teeth, and the men of Boston smashed up the theater in their enraged frustration. With fatalistic dread, he went up to Canada and played in Montreal and Quebec, and to his delighted astonishment was vociferously cheered, without reservation. Kean made a speech. How shall I thank those beings who have rekindled the social spark, almost extinct, and who have lighted up my heart again to friendship and esteem. Canada was a brief, glowing interlude. The Huron Red Indians made the greatest actor a chief of their tribe, and they gave him the name of Alenienwede. Kean accepted the honor with innocent delight. He was now a chief, a king, amongst a noble people. However, he was near the end of his tether. There were now moments of patent insanity, but he refused to succumb. He returned to Britain, and this time quietly. His marriage to Mary was finished. Edmund moved into rooms in Hummum's Hotel, which was here in Covent Garden. In this hotel, his few true friends visited him, including Thomas Grattan. Grattan was horrified at his old friend's continuing physical and mental decline.
Edmund presented a mixture of subdued fierceness, unsatisfied triumph, and suppressed dissipation.
Edmund was propped up in bed, dressed as the Indian chief Alenienwede.
He was clutching a tomahawk in one hand and holding a glass of hot wine with the other.
Two courtiers lounged near the bed, and there was an artist preoccupied with painting the scene. Suddenly, two veiled young women silently appeared and crossed the room. Edmund explained, sotto voce.
Ladies are the daughters of a clergyman. They're both madly in love with me.
Grattan, however, was not convinced, and in another mood, Kean became philosophical about the simple life. He said,
I wish to build a hut for myself in America. Just give me cheese and bread. And a couple of whores, you know.
But the simple life could not be. He had to continue working. Having earned a vast fortune, it was all gone. He had spent it on himself and on many others. There were still flashes of that famous lightning, and the British public closed ranks in renewed adoration of their old hero, now aged 37.
Kean never stopped assailing the great characters of British drama. He continued to tour all over the provinces and then back to London to hold his audience at Drury Lane. But he was now very sick. Waiting for his entrance, he would consume many glasses of brandy and hot water. Someone would warn him that his cue was near. A witness described that moment. He looked about, as from a dream, and sighed and painfully got to his feet, swayed like a column in an earthquake, and marshalling his spirit, entered the stage. At this time of trial, he gave a performance at the Haymarket Theatre of excerpts from the greatest of his successes: Richard III, Overreach, Macbeth, Othello, and Shylock. That one night, £1,370 was taken at the box office, and when he spoke the line, "Richard's himself again," the crammed multitude cheered and cheered. But the flesh was finished. He wrote to a friend,
Fight for me. I have no resources in myself. Mind is gone. Body is hopeless. God knows my heart. I would do, but cannot. Memory, the first of goddesses, has forsaken me. Damn! Goddamn ambition! The soul leaps. The body falls.
In the spring of 1831, he became the lessee of the Richmond Theatre, which stood on the edge of this green, and he moved into a little cottage adjoining. And Aunt Tid, now aged 71 years, moved from her home in Chelsea to look after her sometime little boy.
Edmond Kean suffered a compulsion to try and pull the tragic threads of his life together. He wrote to his estranged wife, "Dear Mary, let us be no longer fools. Come home, forget, and forgive. If I have erred, it was my head, not my heart, and most severely have I suffered for it." Mary Kean visited him at Richmond, but would not come to live.
Kean's son Charles was now an actor, and after an awkward start, he had worked hard and was improving. Edmund proposed that they should perform together. Edmund would play Othello, and his son Charles, Iago. People, remembering the night that Edmund had destroyed Junius Brutus Booth while playing the same role, were fascinated by the encounter. And of course, sentiment ran through the house. Everyone knew that the great man was desperately ill. They had presumed that they would never see him act again.
The theatre was packed. People who observed Edmond Kean arrive in his dressing room could not believe that he intended to go through with the performance. He was pale and shivering. He drank many glasses of brandy. He put on his black makeup and changed into his Othello costume. He called his son and gave him the customary instruction.
Mind you keep before me. I don't know that I shall be able to kneel, but if I do, be sure you'll lift me up.
And then he took his son by the hand and presented him to the public. Edmund's face ran with tears. Girding his feeble strength, he progressed through the first two acts. And then, standing in the wings, watching his son, he said,
Charles is getting on tonight. He's acting very well. I suppose that is because he's acting with me.
The play continued, and the climax of Kean's performance arrived. The house waited in awed expectancy. Kean spoke the line, "Othello's occupation's gone," which precedes the terrible eruption, "Villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore." The famous eruption that had ever destroyed all challenges to his title. Kean opened his mouth. And nothing. All was finished. As he fell, his arms went around his son, and he said, "Oh God, I am dying. You speak to them for me." And he lost consciousness. A critic was moved to write, not in prose, but in verse. "Whate'er thine errors, Kean, whate'er thy shame, thou art the sun's bright child."
Edmond Kean did not die on the stage of Covent Garden. He was carried back to Richmond. Indeed, he rallied sufficiently to go out of doors just once more. He went in his carriage to see Aunt Tid in Chelsea. He said goodbye. And then on May the 15th, 1833, the actor died. Nobody knows for certain where Edmond Kean was born. No inscription marks a birthplace. And nobody knew until very recently where exactly he was buried. It was somewhere in this Richmond church. The poet has told us that each night Kean inscribed his actor's message with flashes of lightning. And that, after all, was sufficient. Mr. O'Toole, let us two actors have the honor of laying Edmond Kean's tombstone.
Fingers, Kenneth, fingers. Away they go. Right, all right. Move your fingers now.